We're joined on INSEAD Knowledge by Professor Anil Gupta. You're a professor of strategy at INSEAD. You were talking recently at a conference in Hong Kong about innovation. With China and India, is it essentially more imitation at the moment rather than innovation?
Imitation clearly is a huge part of the story in both China and India. But two things I would say that one needs to keep in mind. Number one is that in any field of endeavor, including actually in the fine arts, imitation is always the first step towards becoming innovative, because one has to know the basics. One has to be able to digest, absorb ideas, technology from other countries. So that's number one, is that yes, imitation, but as a first step towards innovation. The second thing to keep in mind is that both China and India still are at a relatively early stage of development. They're still poor economies. And in fact, it's well known, and that's what the US did more than 100 years back, that when you're a poor economy, initial focus needs to be on absorbing technology and ideas from other more developed societies. And then, when you become sort of like a middle income economy, then to say, now we need to get really innovative. So I think that's an accurate statement. But at the same time, both China and India are pushing quite aggressively now in terms of creating their own innovations and not just relying on imitation.
So in Hong Kong, you were talking about patents granted by the US Patent Office, and only 1,700 in China, from China, as opposed to some 80,000 in the US, so a long way behind. But even of that 1,700, half had been submitted by MNCs.
That is true. So I would look at it this way, that the innovation story, science, technology, R&D story in China, in several parts, it's both some major pluses, but at the same time, some major, let's say, concerns. So the pluses would be that if you look at some measures of input and some measures of output, that in terms of the expenditure on R&D, that China's expenditure on R&D for the last 10 years or so has been growing at about 20% a year, in a context where the GDP has been growing at about 10% a year. So clearly, it's a deliberate part of national policy to boost China's capabilities in science, technology, and innovation. Number one. Number two, if you look at patents, and here I look at there are many measures, but the most conservative measure on the patenting side would be patents granted by the US Patent Trademark Office. And there the numbers are 1,700, which in an absolute sense is a relatively small number. But then if you look at the trend line, that over the last 5 years, this actually represents a more than a 30% annual increase. And so the trend line is very good. And if it were to, in fact, continue at the current pace, or even slightly slower than the current pace, by 2020, by 2025, China origin patents granted by the USPTO could exceed those from Germany, UK, France, and Italy combined. So the trend line is very good. On the negative side, what I would say is that given the amount of money that China as a country, private and public sector in defense, is putting into R&D, the productivity of that R&D still actually is very low. And partly it's a stage of development issue, because to get technology, ideas, patentable products out of R&D efforts, you need a whole stock of knowledge. It's like if you parachute in from nowhere and start spending money on R&D, you're not going to be very productive. And if you look at US and Europe, we have decades of scientific advancement to build on. So that's just a stage of development issue. But in addition to that, there are other issues in China which are more systemic, which are more cultural. For example, the emphasis on rote learning. At the same time, it's in fact, even in the Chinese media, it's widely reported that there is rampant plagiarism in the academic institutions. There is rampant mismanagement in terms of the allocation of R&D dollars, R&D budget from the government side, in terms of it's not really based on peer-reviewed assessment of proposals, rather who you know. and so on. So there is, clearly significant amount of wastage in how the money is spent, aside from cultural issues. But the trend line is very, very impressive.
But critics would argue that it's essentially the MNCs that are bringing innovation to China.
Yes, and I think that is very true. Is that half of the inventions from China, which have got patents in the US, for example, over half of them actually are MNCs, like an IBM, Microsoft, a GE, a Cisco, doing R&D work in China, and the same thing applies to India. But to me, actually, that's really not an issue at all. And the reason why this is not an issue is because, for example, when Microsoft, which have a huge R&D center in Haidian, in Beijing, that when they do R&D there, more than 95% of the people actually doing that R&D are Chinese, and they're not expat Chinese, they are Chinese. And how Silicon Valley happened is that, it started with Hewlett-Packard, which did R&D, but then over time, people, they learn how to do it, and then they leave Hewlett-Packard, they go to other companies, they do their own startups, and we are beginning to see the same thing from a Microsoft in China. So therefore, yes, Microsoft is a foreign company, but the people who work at Microsoft are not foreign. And they, in fact, develop that technology. They develop the capabilities, and all of that knowledge, is in their heads. And at some point, that knowledge diffuses out. They leave Microsoft, they start their own companies, they go to Chinese companies, and so on. And so it creates builds an innovation ecosystem. So to me, that issue doesn't concern.
So what would you say are the strengths of each country?
I think it's a range of factors. I mean, if you look at from the perspective of the Western multinationals, I think virtually all Western multinationals now have R&D centers in China as well as India, and so therefore, and they tried not to duplicate the work, but to push certain technologies, certain products, certain platforms out of China, push certain other ones out of India. That's number one. If you look at the country as a whole, China, or a country as a whole, India, then I would say that in different ways, each country has its own strengths. So if you look at fundamental science and technology, I would say China is ahead of India because, as an economy that's 4 times as large as India's, China is putting in a lot more money into science, technology, and innovation. But on the other hand, if you look not at science and technology, but we look at this new emerging paradigm, what I would call it market-centric innovation, frugal innovation, which is really creating ultra-low-cost products and services and solutions for the very poor, for the middle and poor. And that actually is a very large number of people, not just in India, but in emerging economies as a whole. And that's now being recognized as a very large market. So in the art and science of frugal innovation, I would say India is clearly the world leader today. So I think comparatively speaking, different strengths and different weaknesses between the two at this point in time.
So what sort of technologies do you think that India and China will focus on? We're seeing investment in clean tech, for example, in China.
I think, China, if you look at the big efforts in China, clean tech is one for sure. And right now, still, we haven't seen kind of massive innovations come out. So a lot of the clean tech story in China at present is more about investment in terms of building the capacity, whether it's wind power capacity or solar power capacity and so on, but rather than innovation per se. But certainly a lot of effort is being put in, and over time it is likely that we would see innovations come out from China. Another area where China is putting a lot of effort is biotech. So biotech, nanotech, again, the new technology domains, a lot of effort being put in China on that front. India, I think, is ahead of China right now from what I understand by talking to people in the industry, and I hear this from a lot of people in different companies, that in the pharmaceutical sector, India appears to be ahead of China. So India started out as being a world leader along with Israel in terms of genetics, which wasn't really about innovation. It was about process efficiency and certainly process innovation. But Indian pharmaceutical companies are rapidly moving ahead in terms of innovative products, innovative drug R&D. And increasingly, almost it's like once a month, you hear of a tie-up between one of the big Western pharma companies and an Indian company because the Western multinational wants to leverage now the innovative R&D being done by Indian companies. So those are certainly some of the areas. Plus, of course, work goes on in terms of technology for services. And so, historically, if you look at IT services, for instance, it's largely been a people game. So if you want to increase your revenue by twice, you need to increase the number of people by 2. But companies, be that IBM in India, Accenture in India, or the Indian companies like Tata, Wipro, Infosys, they're beginning to realize that now that they have 140,000 people, and then if they continue to grow at 15–20% a year, they're going to have 500,000 people, before you blink an eye. And they're beginning to realize that actually they need to start thinking technology rather than people. And a lot of effort is being done in terms of technology advancement for the delivery of services. Also, as sort of along the same domain, Google, for instance, that one of the big things for Google and similarly for other companies is cloud computing. And Google's Center for Excellence on Cloud Computing is in India. So we see these kind of efforts going on in both China and India.
So when do you expect companies then to compete head-to-head in terms of innovative products?
I think what we will probably begin to see is in certain product categories. We will begin over the next 5 years, companies from China and in India begin to compete head-to-head. We are probably going to see that certainly in the software sector. We are beginning to see some activities. We will begin to see that to some extent in the automotive sector. We are beginning to see that already in the pharma sector. So I think and out of China, we will begin to see in terms of transportation, fast trains, for example. So it will start in certain niches and then spread over time. But so that way, for a China or an India to be like a Japan or a Germany or a US in terms of competing across the board in science, technology, and innovation, I would say we're talking about 2 decades.
Professor Anil Gupta, thanks for joining us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thank you very much, Stuart.